At 72, Arthur had already buried a son, lost a house, and watched the numbers in his bank account shrink down to dust, a final, quiet insult after a life of hard work. Alara, a year younger, had folded her hands and watched it happen beside him, her silence a shared language of loss that needed no translation. All the people who were supposed to have been there, the distant relatives with their pitying phone calls and the banker with his polished shoes and apologetic smile, left them with a pension that barely covered bread and medicine. So they took that dust, the last of it, and bought a ruin for $10, a single, crisp bill passed over a worn municipal counter. They bought the old trolley barn at the edge of town, the one with the collapsed roof and the floor that had been underwater for 3 decades, and the town council, in a moment of what they considered benevolent pity, laughed. They laughed at the sheer, stubborn foolishness of 2 old people buying a swampy grave for a building. But what nobody knew, what the water and the rot and the laughter had hidden for nearly a century, was what was sealed behind the north wall, the only part of the structure that had remained stubbornly, impossibly dry. That, though, comes later. First, there was the meeting. It was held in the town hall, a room that smelled of floor wax and stale coffee, the fluorescent lights humming a low, anxious note overhead. Arthur stood before the council, his hands clasped behind his back, his knuckles white. He was not a tall man, and age had stooped his shoulders, but there was a straightness in his spine that refused to yield. Alara sat in the front row, her gaze fixed on him, her presence a silent anchor. The mayor, a man whose ambition had outpaced his compassion long ago, looked down at them over his reading glasses. $10, he said, the words dripping with a kind of amused disbelief. You understand the property is condemned, Arthur. The demolition costs alone are estimated at $50,000. You're taking on the liability. Arthur nodded once, a short, sharp motion. We understand. A man from the back of the room, a local developer named Sterling who owned half the downtown businesses, let out a soft chuckle. It was a sound like coins rubbing together, dry and metallic. Sterling had plans for that land, plans involving glass-walled condominiums and a river view, and the town's inability to afford the demolition had been the only thing slowing him down. Seeing these 2 paupers take the problem off the town's hands for the price of a cheap lunch was a gift he hadn't expected. What in God's name are you going to do with it? Someone else called out. Start a duck farm? Laughter rippled through the room. Alara's expression did not change. She had heard the laughter of crowds before, at school plays, at town picnics, at weddings. This was a different species of sound. It was the laughter of people who believed they were watching the final, foolish act in a long, sad story. Arthur cleared his throat. The sound was small in the suddenly quiet room. We'll live in it, he said, his voice as plain and unadorned as the worn flannel of his shirt. It's a place to be. The laughter this time was louder, less restrained. The mayor banged his gavel, a performative gesture of order. Sold, he declared, a grin playing at the corners of his mouth. To Mr. and Mrs. Gable, for the sum of $10. May God have mercy on your souls. They walked out of the town hall and into the gray afternoon light. The deed, a single flimsy piece of paper, folded in Arthur's pocket. They did not speak. They had said everything that needed saying in the quiet moments of the weeks before, sitting at their small kitchen table in the rented apartment that had never felt like home. They had lost their son to a sickness that took its time, that drained their savings account with the slow, steady drip of a leaky faucet until nothing was left. The house they had built, the one with the maple tree their boy had climbed, was sold to cover the final bills. They were left with his memory, a few boxes of photographs, and a feeling of being untethered from the world. The trolley barn was not a choice. It was the only piece of ground left on earth they could afford to stand on. Some folks measure a place by the square foot. Alara had said that one evening, looking out the window at the brick wall of the neighboring building. Others measure it by the soul. They drove their old truck, its engine rattling a weary rhythm, to the edge of town where the road dissolved into mud and weeds. And there it was. The barn was a skeleton picked clean by years of rain and neglect. Most of the roof had caved in, leaving the massive timber frames exposed to the sky like the ribs of a beached whale. The windows were shattered, dark mouths gaping open. A thick, green scum covered the stagnant water that filled the foundation, rising halfway up the great sliding doors that had been rusted shut for a generation. It smelled of decay, of wet earth and things forgotten. It was worse than they had imagined. Arthur got out of the truck and stood at the edge of the muck, his boots sinking into the soft ground. Alara came and stood beside him. For a long time they just looked. This was it, the final chapter, a flooded ruin and the echo of laughter. But as the wind sighed through the broken rafters, Alara noticed something. The foundation, where it was visible above the waterline, was made of massive, hand-cut stones, fitted together with a precision that defied the chaos above it. The work was true. Arthur saw it too. He wasn't looking at the collapsed sections, but at the main central beam, a single piece of old-growth timber as thick as his body. It was scorched in places, scarred by time, but it had not bowed. It held the memory of straightness. He reached into his pocket and his fingers closed around a small, smooth object. A wooden bird, carved from a piece of scrap pine. Its wings swept back as if in flight. He had made it for his son, Daniel, in the last weeks. It was the only thing he had made since. He held it now, its familiar shape a small, hard point of solace in his palm. "Well?" Alara said, her voice quiet but firm, pulling him back from the edge of memory. "The first thing we need is a pump." The story of the trolley barn was, in the town's telling, a simple one. It was the story of a failure. A man named Silas Croft had built it in the 1920s, a grand vision of connecting their small river town to the industrial hubs in the north. He had poured every penny he had into the iron rails and the magnificent brick barn that would house the electric trolleys. The barn went up, a cathedral of industry with soaring ceilings and arched windows. But the trolleys ran for less than a year. The Great Depression arrived like a frost, killing the whole enterprise overnight. Silas Croft lost everything. He died a few years later, a recluse, a bitter and broken man who was seen only shuffling through town for groceries, his eyes fixed on the ground. The town remembered him as a fool, a man who had dreamed too big and fallen too far. The barn became his monument, a testament to his failure that slowly crumbled year by year, the river reclaiming the land with every spring flood. That was the official story, the one told to schoolchildren on local history tours, the one Mr. Sterling repeated with a dismissive wave of his hand. But there was another story, a quieter one, held in the memories of a few old souls like Beatrice, who ran the diner on Main Street. The diner was a small, warm place that always smelled of coffee and frying bacon. Beatrice had been pouring coffee in that same spot for 50 years. Her hands gnarled with arthritis, but her movements still deft and sure. Arthur and Alara went there the morning after they bought the barn, nursing 2 mugs of coffee they couldn't really afford. They were the only customers. Beatrice brought the pot over and refilled their cups without asking. "Heard you bought the old Croft place," she said, her voice raspy but kind. She didn't laugh. Arthur nodded, stirring his coffee though it had no sugar. Trying to make a go of it, Beatrice leaned against the counter, her arms crossed. "Silas Croft wasn't the man they say he was," she said, her eyes looking past them, into a distant memory. "Everyone remembers the money he lost. Nobody remembers the man." She told them about Silas's wife, Martha, a woman with a gentle face who used to bring Beatrice's mother fresh eggs. Martha never saw the barn as a failure. She called it his workshop, she'd say. "Silas is doing his true work now." Beatrice remembered Martha talking about the smell of sawdust on her husband's clothes, the way he would lock himself in the barn for hours, long after the tracks had been torn up for scrap metal. "And I remember the fire," Beatrice said, her voice dropping lower. "The big mill fire in 28. It took half the men on the east side of the river. Left dozens of children without fathers, whole families with nothing. It was a terrible time. The town nearly broke." She paused, wiping the counter with a damp cloth, a habit of motion that seemed to help her think. And then, a strange thing started happening. Little things. A new pair of shoes would appear on a doorstep, a bag of flour, and toys. Beautiful, hand-carved wooden toys. A horse, a little doll cradle, a spinning top. They'd just show up in the night. No one ever knew where they came from. We called them the midnight gifts. They kept the spirit in this town from dying altogether. She looked at Arthur and Alara, her gaze sharp. My older brother got a little wooden boat. He kept it his whole life. Said it was the finest thing he ever owned. She poured them more coffee. Martha Croft passed away not long after Silas. She told my mother once, just before the end. A promise must be kept. Never said what promise. Beatrice pushed a plate with 2 slices of pie toward them. On the house, she said, before they could protest. You'll need your strength. They left the diner with the taste of apple pie and a story that didn't fit the official record. They drove back to the barn, the gray sky pressing down. But the air inside the truck felt a little lighter. The ruin at the end of the road looked different now. It was still a wreck, still a monument to failure, but now it held a question. The first week was a battle against the water. Arthur bought a small, gas-powered pump with the last of their emergency cash. For 3 days it chugged and sputtered, spitting a steady stream of brown, foul-smelling water out of the barn and into the ditch beside the road. Slowly, like a landmass emerging from a receding sea, the floor of the barn revealed itself. It was a disaster. A thick layer of silt and muck covered everything. Rotted timbers, rusted machine parts, and decades of debris were half buried in the sludge. It seemed a hopeless task, but as the water level dropped, they saw that the main floor was made of thick concrete, and beneath the mud, it was largely intact. And they were not entirely alone. On the second day, they found the cat. It was a scruffy, 3-legged animal, a tom with a torn ear and eyes the color of pale jade. It watched them from atop a high beam, unafraid and proprietary. It had clearly been living there for a long time. Alara left out a small bowl of milk. The cat ignored it. The next day, she left another. By the end of the week, the cat would appear from the shadows whenever their truck rumbled to a stop, accepting the offering with a grudging dignity before retreating to its post. It always sat in the same place, on a pile of debris near the back against the north wall. It was the only corner of the massive building that seemed, for some reason, to be higher than the rest. The water had never quite reached it. It was just a patch of dry ground in a sea of mud. A place to keep your paws dry. That's all they thought it was at first. Mr. Sterling arrived on a Tuesday, his silver car gliding to a stop just where the pavement ended, its tires unsullied by the mud. He stepped out, dressed in a tailored suit that seemed absurdly out of place against the backdrop of the decaying barn. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who had never been told no. Arthur was on his hands and knees, prying a rotted plank from the floor. Alara was scrubbing the silt from a section of the brick wall with a stiff brush and a bucket of river water. They were both covered in grime, their faces streaked with sweat and dirt. Sterling watched them for a moment, a faint, pitying smile on his face. "Quite the project you've taken on," he said, his voice smooth and pleasant. It was the kind of pleasantness that set your teeth on edge. Arthur slowly got to his feet, his back groaning in protest. He wiped his hands on his overalls. "It keeps us busy." "I'm sure it does," Sterling said, his eyes scanning the ruin, his expression making it clear he saw nothing but a liability. "Listen, I'll be frank. I'm the one who's going to be developing this whole stretch of riverfront. This eyesore is standing right in the middle of my plans." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a checkbook. "I admire your spirit. I truly do. But you're in over your heads. I'm prepared to offer you $100 for the deed. A 10-fold return on your investment." He smiled, as if he were bestowing a great gift. "Consider it a charitable donation. It'll save you the headache, and frankly, it'll save me the trouble of waiting for the building to collapse on you." Alara stopped scrubbing. She looked at Sterling, her eyes clear and direct. She did not say a word. Her silence was more powerful than any argument. Arthur looked from Sterling's polished shoes to his expensive watch, then back to the checkbook in his hand. He thought of the $10 bill, a small act of desperation that was theirs alone. He thought of Beatrice's story, of the midnight gifts and the man who did his true work in this very place. "The property is not for sale," Arthur said. The words were quiet, but they landed in the air with the weight of stone. Sterling's smile faltered. He seemed genuinely confused, as if Arthur had just started speaking in a foreign language. "I don't think you understand," he said, his tone hardening slightly. "This structure is worthless. It's a pile of bricks and rotten wood. I'm offering you $100 for a piece of paper that's going to end up costing you thousands." "We understand its value," Alara said, her voice calm and even. Sterling stared at her, then back at Arthur. He saw only two stubborn, filthy old fools. He snapped the checkbook shut. "Fine," he said, the pleasantness gone, replaced by a sharp, cold edge. "Have it your way. But the town has safety ordinances. A building this derelict is a public nuisance. I'll be having a word with the council. You'll have a demolition order on your door within a month. And when you can't pay for it, I'll be there to take this land off your hands for the price of the lien." He got back in his car, the door closing with a solid, expensive thud. He spun the wheels in the mud as he pulled away, splattering the side of their old truck with dirt. They watched him go, the silver car disappearing down the road. The threat hung in the air, heavy and real. 30 days. They looked at the mountain of work ahead of them, the collapsed roof, the muck-filled floor. It was impossible. For the first time, a sliver of despair worked its way through Arthur's resolve. He looked at Alara. She was already picking up her brush again, dipping it in the bucket. She started scrubbing the wall, her movements rhythmic and determined. "He measures things in dollars," she said, not looking at him. "It's the only language he knows. We'll just have to teach him another one inch." The days that followed took on a new urgency. They worked from sunrise until the light failed, fueled by Beatrice's coffee and the sandwiches she started dropping off every day at noon. They cleared the debris wheelbarrow by painful wheelbarrow. They shoveled out the last of the muck. Arthur, using his old carpentry skills, began to assess the timber frame. He found that while much of the secondary wood was rotted, the main post and beam structure, the heart of the barn, was made of hemlock and oak, and it was still sound. It was the work of a master craftsman. The building had good bones. The three-legged cat, whom Alara had named Silas, became their constant companion. It would follow them as they worked, keeping a cautious distance, but always present. And always, when it rested, it returned to the same spot, the dry patch of floor against the north wall. Arthur had become obsessed with that wall. While the other three walls were of a uniform red brick, weathered and ancient, the north wall was different. The bricks were a slightly different color, the mortar joints thicker, less precise. It was as if it had been built by a different hand, or at a different time. And it was dry, bone dry, from the concrete floor to the high rafters, while the rest of the barn was saturated with a dampness that would take a year of summer sun to bake out. One afternoon, while Alara was outside clearing weeds from the foundation, Arthur ran his hand over the bricks of the north wall. The cat, Silas, sat nearby, watching him with its pale, knowing eyes. Arthur pressed on the bricks, testing them. Most were solid, immovable, but then his fingers found one halfway up the wall that seemed to give just a fraction of an inch. His heart quickened. He pushed again, harder. The brick shifted. It wasn't mortared in place. It was a plug. He worked his fingers around the edges, his hands clumsy with excitement. With a soft scraping sound, the brick came loose. He pulled it out and peered into the darkness behind it. It wasn't solid. There was a cavity, a hollow space. "Alara," he called out, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You'd better come see this." Alara came inside, wiping her hands on her apron, her face shaded by a wide-brimmed hat. She saw the brick in Arthur's hand, the dark hole in the wall, and the look on his face. She came and stood beside him, and together they peered into the opening. The air that drifted out was not the damp, musty smell of the rest of the barn. It was dry, cool, and smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. It was the smell of a place that time had forgotten. Arthur reached for his flashlight, his hand trembling slightly. He shone the beam into the hole. It didn't illuminate a small cavity. It revealed a vast, dark space. This wasn't just a different wall. It was a false wall. A wall built in front of another, sealing something off. "It's a room," Alara breathed, her voice filled with awe. He built a room inside the room, forgetting their aching backs and weary muscles. They began to work with a feverish energy. Arthur found a small crowbar, and carefully, brick by brick, they began to dismantle the wall around the loose one. The bricks came away easily, held by a crumbling, sandy mortar. It was clear the wall had been built hastily, designed to conceal, not to support. Behind it, they found another wall, this one made of thick, tongue-and-groove cedar planks, fitted together with the same precision they had seen in the foundation stones. There was a door in the center of the cedar wall, not with a knob, but with a simple wooden latch. The wood was not swollen or warped. It was as straight and true as the day it was hung. The cat, Silas, sat perfectly still, watching them, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. Arthur put his hand on the latch. He looked at Alara. Her eyes, full of a light he hadn't seen in years, met his. He lifted the latch. The door swung inward without a sound, the hinges moving as smoothly as if they had been oiled yesterday. The room beyond was dark. Arthur swept the beam of his flashlight across it. It was not a large room, perhaps 15 feet square. It was completely dry, the cedar walls and floor seeming to glow in the flashlight's beam. And it was full, not with gold or treasure, but with things made of wood. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, and on them, arranged in neat, orderly rows, were hundreds of objects. There were dozens of toy horses, each one unique, with manes of real horsehair and tiny leather saddles. There were spinning tops painted in bright, cheerful colors, their pigments still vibrant. There were dolls, their bodies carved from pine and their faces painted with simple, serene expressions. There were miniature sets of furniture, tiny chairs, tables, and cradles, each one a perfect replica. On the floor were larger items, rocking horses, small wagons, a child's desk with a matching chair. It was a secret factory of joy, a hidden world of childhood wonder. Every single piece was crafted with an astonishing level of skill and love. The sanding was so fine the wood felt like silk. The joints were seamless. The painted details were delicate and precise. This was not the work of a failed businessman. This was the work of a master artisan, a man who poured his soul into every cut, every joint, every brushstroke. In the center of the room sat a single heavy workbench. On it, a set of carving tools lay in a neat row, their wooden handles dark with the patina of use. Next to them, a half-finished figure of a small bird sat, its wings outstretched, waiting for a final touch. It was almost identical to the one Arthur carried in his pocket. He reached in and pulled his out, his hand shaking. He set it on the bench beside the unfinished one. They were two verses of the same song, carved 60 years apart. And beside the tools, sitting squarely in the center of the bench, was a thick, leather-bound book. It was a ledger. Arthur reached out and touched its cover. It was cool and smooth. He opened it. The first page had a single sentence, written in a neat, elegant script, a record of debts paid. The pages that followed were filled with entries, column after column, written in the same hand. Each entry contained a date, a name, usually just a child's first name and a last initial, an address, and a description of an item. October 12, 1928. Mary P. 14 River Street. One doll cradle, maple with painted flowers, November 3, 1928.
Thomas K. 8 Millionen Ellie.
One wooden boat, pine with cloth sail, December 24, 1928. The Miller Children. 22 Water Street. 3 spinning tops, 1 horse, 2 dolls. There were hundreds of entries, spanning nearly 20 years. It was a secret history of the town, a record of quiet, anonymous kindness. This was the true work Martha Croft had spoken of. This was the source of the midnight gifts. Silas Croft hadn't been a recluse, nursing his failure. He had been a craftsman, a secret saint, spending his last 2 decades repaying a debt no one knew he felt he owed. A debt to the families broken by the fire, to the community he had failed with his grand trolley scheme. He had paid it back not with money, which he no longer had, but with his time, his skill, and his heart. If you have stayed with this story this far, stay a little longer, because what happens next is the part one have been waiting to tell you. Arthur and Alara stood in the silent, fragrant room, the beam of the flashlight illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, and they understood. They had not bought a ruin. They had inherited a legacy. The barn was not a building. It was a promise. And a promise, as Martha Croft had said, must be kept. The discovery of the hidden room changed everything. It was no longer a race to make a derelict building habitable. It was a mission to protect a sacred space. The 30-day demolition notice, which had seemed like a death sentence, now felt like a declaration of war. Sterling's threat was no longer just about property. It was an attack on memory itself. They spent the next few days in the secret room, poring over the ledger. The names on the pages were a roll call of the town's oldest families. They recognized many of them. The grandparents of the current mayor, the great-aunt of the woman who ran the post office, the father of the man who owned the hardware store. It was the town's entire history, told through small acts of grace. Tucked into the back of the ledger, they found a sealed envelope, the paper yellowed with age. On the front, in Silas Croft's elegant script, were the words, "To the one who finds this Arthur's hands, calloused and stiff from a lifetime of labor," fumbled with the seal. Alara steadied them with her own. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded twice. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. It was not a will or a deed, but a confession and a plea. "If you are reading this," it began, "then you have found my workshop. And you have likely found it because you saw the building not for what it is, but for what it could be. For that, I thank you. The world has too many who see only the rot, and not enough who see the bones." Silas went on to explain his reasoning. The trolley line had been his great pride, but its failure, coupled with the devastation of the mill fire that happened in the same year, had left him feeling like he had doubly failed his town. He felt a profound debt. He had no money left to give, but he had his hands, his tools, and a barn full of wood. "I could not mend their broken hearts," he wrote, "but I could give their children a moment of joy. I could give them something beautiful in a world that had turned ugly. It was the only coin I had left to pay." He explained how he had worked at night, delivering the gifts in secret, because he did not want thanks. The work was not for them. It was for him, for the mending of his own soul. He had built the false wall in the last year of his life, when he felt his strength failing. He feared that after he was gone, someone would buy the barn for scrap, and his work would be thrown on a fire, its meaning lost. He sealed it away, a time capsule of kindness, trusting that Providence would one day lead the right person to it. The letter ended with a simple, powerful charge. "This room is not a treasure to be sold," he wrote. "It is a story to be told. The toys are not for collecting. They are for giving. The work is not finished. If you are a person who understands this, then the barn is yours. Its purpose is yours. A thing isn't what it's worth in money. It's what it's worth in memory. Keep the promise." Arthur finished reading and fell silent. The weight of the words settled upon him, a heavy but noble burden. He looked around the room at the silent, waiting toys. He looked at the unfinished bird on the workbench. He understood now. Silas Croft hadn't just left behind a room of objects. He had left a job to be completed. A few days later, the official notice was nailed to the front of the barn. A large, bright orange sign, declaring the building unsafe and ordering its demolition within 30 days. The legal language was cold and absolute. It was signed by the town clerk, a man named Miller. The sight of it felt like a physical blow. Time was running out. Arthur and Alara knew they couldn't fight Sterling and the town council with lawyers and money they didn't have. They had only one weapon: the truth. They had to tell the story. They started with Beatrice. They brought the ledger to the diner one morning before the breakfast rush. They sat in a booth and opened it on the table. Beatrice put on her reading glasses and bent over the page they showed her. December 10th, 1928. Daniel S. 4 Orchard Lane. One wooden boat, pine, with blue sail. Beatrice stared at the entry, her finger tracing the faded ink. Her breath caught in her throat. "Daniel S.," she whispered. "That was my brother, Danny. We lived on Orchard Lane." She looked up at them, her eyes wide with a dawning 60-year-old wonder. "The boat. I remember that boat. It just appeared on our porch one morning. My mother said it was a gift from the angels." Tears welled in her eyes, tears of memory, not of sadness. She closed the ledger gently, as if it were a holy book. "Silas Croft," she said, her voice thick with emotion. It was him. All this time she looked at them, a fierce new light in her eyes. "Sterling wants to tear it down, doesn't he?" Arthur nodded. "He's got the council in his pocket." Beatrice took off her apron. "The council meets in 2 weeks to finalize the order," she said, her voice low and steady. "We need to show them. We need to make them listen." The next 2 weeks were a blur. Beatrice became their general. She started talking to her oldest customers, people whose families had been in the town for generations. She would show them a name in the ledger, and a memory would flicker to life. A story about a grandfather who had a carved horse he swore was magic. An aunt who kept a tiny doll in a cedar box her whole life. The stories, long dormant, began to surface, passed down through families, their origins a mystery until now. The midnight gifts were not just a forgotten footnote. They were woven into the very fabric of the town's oldest families. While Beatrice gathered the stories, Arthur worked. He went back to the workbench in the secret room. He picked up Silas Croft's carving tools. They felt familiar in his hand, an extension of his own arm. He picked up the unfinished bird and, with slow, careful strokes, he began to complete it. He carved the feathers on its wings, sanded its body smooth, and gave it 2 tiny, knowing eyes. He was not just finishing a piece of wood. He was picking up a thread, continuing a conversation that had been silenced for half a century. The day of the town council meeting arrived. It was a cold, rainy evening. Arthur and Alara drove to the town hall, the ledger sitting on the seat between them like a third passenger. In Alara's lap was a small box. They didn't know if anyone would listen. They only knew they had to try. The barn was more than their home now. It was a promise they had to keep. The town hall was more crowded than it had been at the first meeting. Sterling was there, sitting in the front row with his lawyer, looking confident and impatient. The mayor and the council members sat at their raised table, shuffling papers, eager to get the proceedings over with. Beatrice was there, sitting in the third row, and around her were a dozen other older residents, their faces grim and watchful. They were the keepers of the town's long memory. The meeting was called to order. The demolition of the old trolley barn was the first item on the agenda. The mayor spoke, his voice full of false regret. "As you know, the structure at 12 River Road is a public safety hazard. It's an eyesore and a liability. We have a generous offer from Mr. Sterling here to clear the land at his own expense as part of his riverfront revitalization project. The council has reviewed the demolition order, and we are prepared to vote for its final approval." He looked out at the room, expecting no opposition. "Are there any objections?" Arthur stood up. All eyes turned to him. He was no longer the stooped, defeated man from the first meeting. He stood tall, the leather-bound ledger held in his hands. "We object," he said, his voice clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the room. The mayor sighed, a sound of theatrical weariness. "Arthur, we've been over this. The building is condemned. You can't possibly afford the repairs." "This isn't about repairs," Arthur said. "It's about history. It's about a debt." Sterling let out an audible scoff. "A debt? The only debt associated with that property is the one the town owes me for cleaning up this mess." Arthur ignored him. He opened the ledger. "In 1928, the Great Mill Fire destroyed the lives of half this town. A man you all remember as a failure, Silas Croft, spent the next 20 years of his life trying to mend what was broken." He began to read from the ledger. He read the names, the addresses, and the gifts. Mary P., 1 doll cradle. Thomas K., 1 wooden boat. A murmur went through the crowd as the names, familiar and long buried, were spoken aloud. He read a dozen more, his voice steady. each entry a small testament to a forgotten act of kindness. The room grew quiet. The shuffling of papers stopped. The council members looked uneasy. This was not the simple procedural vote they had expected. "It's a lovely story, Arthur," the mayor said, trying to regain control. "A charming piece of local folklore. But it doesn't change the fact that the building is falling down." "The building is not falling down," Arthur countered. "Its bones are strong. It was built to last. But that's not the point. You are not voting to demolish a building. You are voting to demolish a legacy." Sterling stood up, his face flushed with anger. "This is absurd. It's a sentimental fairy tale concocted to stall the inevitable. There's no proof. It's just a list of names in an old book." Elara then stood. She had been silent until now. She held the small box in her hands. She walked to the front of the room and placed it on the table before the mayor. "This isn't a fairy tale," she said, her voice quiet but resonant. She opened the box. Inside, nestled on a piece of soft cloth, was a small, exquisitely carved doll cradle. The maple had yellowed to a beautiful honey color, and on its side were tiny, faded paintings of blue flowers. She turned a page in the ledger that Arthur had marked. "October 12, 1928, she read. "Mary P. 14 River Street. One doll cradle, maple with painted flowers." An old woman in the back of the room gasped. It was Mary P.'s daughter. "My mother's cradle," she whispered. "She kept it her whole life." Elara then turned to another page. Her eyes found Sterling. "There are many names in this book," she said. "Many families who received these gifts, including yours, Mr. Sterling." Sterling froze. "That's a lie," he snapped. "My family has never taken charity from anyone." Elara read the entry, her voice as clear as a bell. "January 5, 1929. Joseph S. 19 Orchard Lane. One rocking horse, oak, made from the wood of the family's old porch swing, which was destroyed in the fire." She looked directly at Sterling. "Your grandfather's name was Joseph, wasn't it, Mr. Sterling?" A dead silence fell over the room. Sterling's face went pale. He remembered the stories his grandmother used to tell, stories of the hard years after the fire, and of a mysterious rocking horse that had appeared on their porch one winter morning, a horse his father had cherished. He had dismissed it as a silly family myth. Now the myth was staring him in the face, recorded in faded ink in a book held by a woman he had called a fool. Before he could respond, Beatrice stood up. "I remember that horse," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "Everyone on Orchard Lane talked about it. The Sterling horse. It was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever seen. It was one of the first midnight gifts." The story was no longer just a story. It was real. It was standing in the room. The faces of the townspeople had changed. The looks of pity and amusement were gone, replaced by expressions of awe and then of shame. They had laughed at these two old people. They had dismissed the barn as a wreck. And all along it had held the best part of their own history, a secret they had been too blind to see. The promise was being remembered. The room was utterly still, the air thick with the weight of revelation. Sterling stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning humiliation. The foundation of his world, built on money and transactions, had just been shaken by a ghost story about a wooden horse. He opened his mouth to speak, to bluster, to deny, but no words came out. The mayor, seeing the mood of the room shift so decisively, began to backpedal. This is certainly new information," he stammered, looking at the other council members, who were avoiding his gaze. "Perhaps we should table this vote, pending a historical review." But the moment for procedure had passed. Another man stood up, a man who had been quiet until now. It was Mr. Miller, the town clerk. He was pale, his hands trembling as he clutched a file folder. "There won't be a vote," he said, his voice cracking. He looked not at the mayor, but at Arthur and Elara. "Because the demolition order is invalid." He walked to the front and laid the folder on the table. "When Mr. Sterling first inquired about the property, he pressured me to expedite the condemnation process. There were historical preservation covenants on the original deed. From the Croft estate, I was told to overlook them. The confession hung in the air, a plain and ugly truth. The deed stipulates that the structure cannot be torn down so long as it is used for community betterment and the craft of woodworking. I buried the paperwork. I'm sorry. He looked at Arthur and Alara, his face crumpled with shame. I'm so sorry. I let him bully me. I thought it was just an old ruin. I didn't know Miller's confession was the final blow. Sterling's empire of influence collapsed in that moment, brought down not by a rival developer or a market crash, but by his own grandfather's rocking horse. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the town hall, his lawyer trailing behind him like a pilot fish. The sound of the heavy doors closing behind him was the only sound in the room. Then someone started to clap. It was a slow, solitary sound at first, coming from the old woman who was Mary P.'s daughter. Then Beatrice joined in, and then another, until the whole room was filled with applause. It wasn't for a victory. It was for a memory. It was for the quiet, stubborn dignity of the two people who had polished that memory until it shone again. Arthur and Alara stood there, not in triumph, but with a kind of humble grace, the ledger held between them. They had not come for applause. They had come to tell a story. The next morning, as the sun burned the mist off the river, a pickup truck that wasn't theirs rumbled down the muddy track to the barn. It was the man who owned the hardware store. He got out, a hammer loop on his belt. "Heard you might need a hand," he said, not quite meeting Arthur's eye. He was one of the men who had laughed at the first meeting. Before Arthur could respond, another car pulled up. And another. Soon there was a small convoy of trucks and cars parked along the road. People got out carrying toolboxes, coils of wire, sacks of concrete mix. Beatrice arrived with 2 enormous thermoses of coffee and a box of donuts. The townspeople, the community chorus that had once mocked them, had arrived to help. There were no grand speeches, no formal apologies. There was just the quiet language of work. A young electrician, the great-grandson of a name in the ledger, spent the day running new wiring. A crew of roofers, volunteering their Saturday, began stripping the rotted shingles and assessing the rafters. Women arrived with buckets and brushes, with food and drink. Mr. Miller, the town clerk, was there, his suit replaced by old clothes. He spent the entire day hauling debris in a wheelbarrow, his face set with a quiet determination to atone. He didn't say much, but his labor was a constant, steady apology. Arthur and Alara moved through the crowd, overwhelmed by the sudden flood of goodwill. They showed people the secret room, and one by one, people stepped inside, their voices hushed with reverence as they looked upon the shelves of toys, finding the echoes of their own family histories. They saw the cradle, the boat, the horse. They touched the smooth wood and understood. The work went on all day, a symphony of hammers and saws and quiet conversation. As evening fell, someone lit a fire in the old pot-bellied stove in the center of the barn. For the first time in 60 years, warmth and light filled the cavernous space. People gathered around it, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames, sharing stories, piecing together the history that had been hidden in plain sight. Arthur and Alara sat on an old crate, side by side, watching the scene. They had sought only a place to be, a roof over their heads. They had found something more. They had found a purpose, and in the process they had found a family. Not a family of blood, but one of memory and shared work. A family that shows up. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm. The initial flood of volunteers subsided, but a dedicated core remained. The barn, which had been a place of decay, became a place of renewal. The roof was patched, the broken windows replaced with salvaged glass. The great sliding doors sanded down and rehung on their tracks. The building slowly began to breathe again. Mr. Miller was there every weekend, his penance a quiet and steady presence. He never spoke of the council meeting again, but his work spoke for him. He repaired the brickwork, his hands growing calloused, his face and clothes perpetually dusty. One Saturday, he approached Alara as she was sweeping the newly cleared floor. "My grandfather," he said, his voice low. "He got a set of wooden soldiers, My father kept them on his desk. I never knew. Ilara simply nodded, her expression one of quiet understanding. There was nothing more that needed to be said. The barn was no longer just a workshop. It was becoming a living museum. The town decided to preserve the secret room exactly as it was, a permanent exhibit, a testament to Silas Croft's hidden life. The main floor of the barn, however, was to be a place of creation, not just preservation. Arthur, with a new light in his eyes, began to set up a workshop. People donated old tools, lumber, and benches. He cleaned and sharpened Silas's old carving tools, their steel holding a keen edge even after all these years. He started to teach. On Saturday mornings, children from the town would come to the barn, and Arthur would show them how to hold a tool, how to read the grain of a piece of wood, how to turn a block of pine into a bird, a boat, a horse. He was a patient teacher, his voice soft, his hands guiding theirs. He never raised his voice. He just showed them the way, letting the wood do the talking. Ilara became the keeper of the stories. She would sit with the children and visitors in the warmth of the pot-bellied stove and tell them about Silas Croft, about the mill fire, about the midnight gifts. She would read from the ledger, making the names on the page come alive. The barn became the heart of the town, a place where the past was not a dusty relic, but a living presence that informed the future. It was a place where people came to build things, to learn, to remember. It was measured now not in square feet, but in soul. One afternoon in late fall, as the leaves of the maple trees by the river turned to gold and crimson, Arthur stood at the workbench, sanding a small wooden horse. The three-legged cat, Silas, was curled up asleep in a patch of sunlight on the floor. Ilara was humming softly as she arranged some of the finished toys on a new set of shelves. They had moved into a small apartment built into the back of the barn, a cozy space that was simple, warm, and entirely their own. They had everything they needed. A letter arrived that week. It was from a law firm in the city. Mr. Sterling, through his attorneys, was making a donation. It was a large sum of money, given anonymously, to establish a trust for the barn's perpetual upkeep and to fund the children's woodworking programs. There was no note of apology, no personal message. Just the money. It was the only language he knew, his own kind of clumsy penance. Arthur and Ilara used the money to ensure the barn would stand for another 100 years, a permanent home for the promise they had inherited. They lived quietly, their days filled with the simple, satisfying work of their hands and hearts. The laughter of the town council was a distant, faded echo, replaced by the laughter of children learning to create something beautiful with their own hands. They had not grown richer in the way the world measures wealth. They still lived on their small pension. But they were wealthy in ways that could not be counted, their lives full of a purpose they had never expected to find. They were home. The final piece of the story fell into place a year later. A new family moved to town, a young couple with a small daughter. They were quiet, kept to themselves. The town learned they had lost their home in a flood in another state and had come here to start over with nothing. They rented a small house on the east side of the river, not far from where the old mill used to be. The little girl, whose name was Hope, rarely smiled. She would watch the other children play from her porch, a small, solitary figure. One evening, just as dusk was settling and the lights were coming on in the houses along the street, Arthur walked past their house. He moved quietly, his footsteps soft on the pavement. He carried something small in his hand. He walked up to the porch, placed the object gently on the top step, and then walked away, disappearing into the twilight. A few moments later, the front door of the house opened, and the little girl stepped out. She saw the object on the step. She bent down and picked it up. It was a bird, carved from a single piece of pale pine. Its wings swept back as if in mid-flight. It was so smooth it felt like a river stone in her hand. She stared at it, her expression slowly changing. A small, wondrous smile spread across her face, the first her parents had seen in months. From across the street, hidden in the shadows of a large oak tree, Arthur and Ilara watched. They saw the smile. They saw the moment of pure, unlooked-for joy. They did not need to be thanked. The work was not for them. It was for the mending. The promise was still being kept. The light from the barn windows glowed warm against the dark night, and the old aphorism from Silas Croft's letter seemed to hang in the quiet air. A thing isn't what it's worth in money, it's what it's worth in memory.